All right, thank you for joining us. My name is Christopher Jordan,
My name is Ryan Cuck.
and we are going to present today on restructuring the music degree. A little background on the both of us. We both have advanced degrees in music, so we have some experience in this area, and it's also something of a passion for us. So let's dive right in. Just a quick overview. We're going to look at the current state of affairs in performance degrees for music. We're going to go over some survey results that we gathered, and we are going to propose a future state for music curriculum for the performance degree. So the need for change. Currently, the institutions of higher learning are wrestling with the practical application of education. This is broad. It's across most colleges, most universities, where the concept of theoretical learning is always in conflict with the practical application out in the job market. There are also gainful employment regulations that are coming down. Right now, these are really focused on for-profit institutions. But as with any sort of government regulation, usually it's a slippery slope into something else. So we are looking at sort of the future state for gainful employment as regards to performing arts careers, and also and specifically for music performance degrees. One thing that we have noticed in our own personal experience, as well as in the literature that we reviewed, is that music schools are largely absent from the discussion on needing to apply practical skills for the workplace for music performance majors. So current music performance degrees. A typical performance degree based on a survey of curricula at the following universities. These universities were drawn from the survey that we conducted. They also represent a fairly broad and I would say a good cross-section of the major state music schools and also some private music schools across the country. We consciously avoided using conservatories because the style of training at conservatories is very different than the state schools that are on this list. So about 70% of a performance degree, an undergraduate performance degree in music, is devoted to music, which would include private lesson instruction, large and small ensembles. This would be your orchestras, your bands, string quartets, and the like. Classes in music history and theory, and other classes that supplement understanding of performance practice tradition. So basically, these classes just prepare someone to be very competent on their instrument and in their field. The remaining 30% of the coursework is devoted to general education and liberal arts, typically your math, science, English, history, and so forth. Electives are required, and they're usually a combination of music electives and non-music electives. And as with all electives, these are up to the discretion of the student. So the product of a performance education in music. You're highly specialized with a narrow focus on performance practice tradition. And you have a competency in your primary performance area, and you are able to perform in ensembles of varying styles and size. Generally, what a performance degree prepares most musicians for in the classical field is to perform in a large ensemble like a professional orchestra.
There are some unintended consequences that come as a result of the setup of the current music performance program. Um, Number one is the lack of full-time professional opportunities force many into freelance work. Just a quick review of five of the universities on the list showed us that there are about 5,000 music students just within those five. Dozens of other programs throughout the country also contain music students. When we compare this to professional opportunities, we find there's about 138 professional orchestras in this country. Those break down to 52 ICSOM and 86 ROPA. Now, ICSOM is basically the professional orchestras, the ones that are full-time professional. They rehearse during the day, perform on the weekends. This will largely be the musician's primary source of income. ROPA orchestras, on the other hand, are mostly per service. So many of the survey responders are going to fit into a lot of these ROPA orchestras. But we included this on the list because a number of these part-time orchestras have several full-time positions, and so they do still provide an opportunity for a few musicians anyway to have full-time employment. Now, freelance work requires business skills that are not taught in the undergraduate program. Now, as a result, most students who major in music performance do not end up making their primary income within their field of study. This is because once they have to get into the freelance world, they're forced into the freelance world due to the deficit of full-time work. They end up having to go into this freelance world unprepared and end up moving completely away from music for their primary source of income. So the survey that we developed and sent out was targeted at professional musicians who completed a bachelor's degree in music performance, and we largely specifically targeted freelance musicians, not necessarily the full-time musicians. We wanted to investigate the extent to which respondents made or currently make their living as performers. Asked respondents to identify very specific freelance activities which they've generated income. And then the categories in these surveys include teaching, ensemble performance, other freelance work, and entrepreneurial activities. Now, we distributed the survey using some of our own personal social media, as well as we reached out to a number of those regional part-time per-service orchestras, asked them to distribute to their rosters, as well as we reached out to a number of union locals and ask them to distribute to their rosters as well. All right, let's review some of our survey results. As you can see, we asked a question as whether or not freelancing was ever a primary source of household or personal income. So primary source of household income means that's how they make their living. Personal income may be a situation where it's a secondary income in a household, provides a significant boost, but isn't dependent to pay their bills. Now, when about 84% of our respondents fell into the category as at some point in their life having income that fell into those two categories. First activity was teaching activity. Our first question was related to teaching activities they've engaged in. These are the results. Primarily, the biggest answer was home studios. This would be, just teaching private lessons out of one's home. A number of them have served in some capacity with a university or community college. Many of these are often part-time positions or as-need type of positions. And then our next biggest category was clinicians. This is often all-state ensembles, youth orchestras, tied to the community youth programs within their area. We then asked them to list categories of orchestras or ensembles they've performed with as a freelance musician. As we mentioned early, you'll see that the largest answer was small regional per-service orchestras, ROPA, we talked about before. Many of the respondents also are on sublists for those full-time orchestras. Now, sublist just means that they get called when needed. They're not a full-time member, but they become essentially a per-service member for a full-time orchestra. And then we also looked at music theater, any kind of non-traditional small ensembles, folk music, whatnot, and then others. So then we asked them to list any ad hoc freelance work they've engaged in. These are just those sort of one-time type events. The vast majority of our respondents have played in some type of special church event, Christmas, Easter, whatnot. Weddings are a big one, corporate events, even funerals. We had a significant number of answers on these. Next, we asked them to list any studio work they've engaged in. This is a recording studio type of work. You'll see that we didn't quite hit as high numbers, but you still had a very large percent of respondents who have engaged in these activities, specifically backing up recording artists, and then others for commercials and soundtracks for film or television. Now, this is a very interesting category for us because we asked them to list any entrepreneurial activities in which they have participated and received revenue. So there are a number of musicians out there who have taken to trying to find new ways to make money outside of what the norm was. This has resulted in YouTube channels and other ventures. So we kind of wanted to get a feel of how many of our respondents are engaged in some of these activities. The primary response that we got, and it was relatively high, was being a performer contractor. This is not surprising, as this is very closely tied to those ad hoc jobs, and the vast majority, upwards of 95% of our respondents were engaged in some type of ad hoc work. So this is something they're familiar with, and that allowed them to engage in the activity as sort of the leader, as the actual contractor when necessary. However, on the other ends of the spectrum, those ones that are truly entrepreneurial, unique, we had far fewer respondents actually engaged in those type of activities. So if we look at the freelance work by category, you'll see teaching, orchestras, ensembles, and ad hoc work all very, very, very prominent. And then it begins to drop off, and we see less respondents are participating in studio work, and even less in entrepreneurial activities. And as mentioned before, the bulk of those people who are in those entrepreneurial activities are generally performer contractor type of roles tied to their engagement in ad hoc work. Towards the end of the survey, we asked what type of activities on the previous page did they have interest in but have not yet engaged in. Probably not surprising is our two lowest of the ones that have engaged are the two highest in this. So these are people who want to engage in these activities, but for some reason have a barrier that prevents them from engaging in those. And the two highest were studio work and entrepreneurial activities. At the very end of the survey, we asked them what skills they feel like they were missing outside of music that have prevented them from being very successful in their freelance career. And we found these results to be quite telling. As you can see in this word cloud developed from their responses, business is a very big one that immediately pops up. As you go through a number of these words, you will see that there are many more words here tied to business, whether that be accounting, finance is one that came up somewhat regularly. Another category that came up regularly is interpersonal communication. You'll see that in different forms throughout this cloud, such as communication, personal. These type of words show up regularly throughout this cloud and are driving where people feel like they're lacking the skills to move forward in their careers. So after a review of everything, the current state of affairs looks like this. After reviewing the curricula, we could only identify one performance degree that incorporated business classes as a requirement. The survey results revealed that a majority of respondents would have benefited from business training before starting their careers.
Okay, so now we're actually going to talk about what we think is the future, which is redesigning the curriculum for undergraduate music performance degrees. So what we did was we actually took the business competencies that we found in the survey results, and we sort of lumped them together in categories. And as you can see here, teaching was one of our big freelance activities, and through that we were able to link specific business competencies with this activity, such as marketing, taxes, accounting and bookkeeping, personal finance, interpersonal communication, etc. With orchestras and ensembles, another big one as far as part-time work or subbing in with a full-time professional orchestra, resume and CV writing, interpersonal communication, personal finance, contract law, negotiation, taxes. These are all very prominent business competencies for these particular activities. If we continue on with the other ones, ad hoc freelancing, we see again marketing, taxes, accounting, bookkeeping, and studio work. The same ones are coming up. And then entrepreneurial activities, this is probably the most interesting because it's going to be the most specific and probably detailed. Copyright law, marketing, taxes, accounting, bookkeeping, personal finance, LLC formation, that's a big one. Marketing, interpersonal communication, contract writing, organizational development, and web design. So what we're looking at here is figuring out what skills do our undergraduate music performance majors need and sort of linking that to these business competencies through the work that they would be doing in the freelance market. So what we did was we actually categorized or at least rated them by frequency of how many times we linked a particular business competency to a freelance activity. And what we see here is personal finance is the one that came up the most. Being able to handle one's money personally when it comes to taxes and everything in between. So the big ones here are personal finance, interpersonal communication, marketing, taxes, accounting, bookkeeping.
And then some of our less prominent ones are those ones tied to entrepreneurial activities. Now, we don't consider this to be an area of less focus because of this reason. That is because we have many people who want to engage in these activities but are not. We see this as a great opportunity to get more of these students actually engaged in these activities to be able to find new ways to develop income through music. And so we find those less prominent ones to actually be just as important to this process.
So we have a proposal with two possibilities. The first is to create up to 4 business-specific classes within a school of music. This will probably be the most challenging one because it would require that the school identify faculty who have a great deal of expertise working in the freelance community and who understand these business skills and can relate them to the students. The benefit of that is that the classes would be very specific to music freelance activities. The other possibility is to require music students to supplement their liberal arts or elective requirements with classes within the business school. So they would travel out to, in whenever university they're in, they would go to the business school and sit in on a couple of business classes of their choice. So with option one, the requirement could be drawn from music electives, general education requirements, or general electives. We propose 4 classes that are organized as follows. A finance class, where you would look at personal finance, accounting, and taxes. A marketing class, this would deal with web design, interpersonal communication, and even resume and CV writing. Entrepreneurial development would involve the LLC formation topics, organizational development, and opportunity recognition. And then a class strictly on law because it involves everything from copyright law, contract writing, and negotiation. And this is an area where many musicians who are untrained fall into trouble because they don't understand contracts, they don't understand how they're written.
And as we saw in the survey results, very large percent of our respondents are engaged in some type of regional orchestra activity. These organizations often operate on large contracts over 3 to 5 years, and then it's up to the musicians to then be able to negotiate their new contracts. This is very important to a large part of our respondents.
Okay, so the second option, students would be required to choose from existing business classes already provided by the university. We mentioned earlier in the presentation that there was one example we found where uh, students in the School of Music were required to take a business class, and this was at Northwestern University. They have what's called a business overlay. So at that school, students are required to take 6 units, or essentially 6 classes, in general education, and they're distributed across the range of a liberal arts education. Within that, students are required to take one business or finance class, which replaces one of the general education requirements. And in their handbook, they specifically talk about the need to provide the students with a broader education to prepare them for life after the School of Music. The new curriculum would require a minimum of 2 business classes to replace general education or non-music elective requirements. So what we propose is if option one is not possible, to take option two, where you have the students go to a school of business, take 2 specific business classes that replace general education or elective requirements within their degree plan. So as we wrap up, we've come to 2 conclusions. The first is that music performance degrees are insufficient for the current freelance job market. As we mentioned before, this is borne out from personal experience as well as the respondents from our survey. and that we see there is an opportunity to expand the current curriculum of undergraduate music performance majors by providing practical business skills to help them once they graduate and are forced into a competitive freelance market. I'd like to thank you for your time today. If you have any questions or comments about this presentation, please feel free to reach out to us. You'll find our contact information below. We would welcome any and all comments or questions that you may have. Thank you for joining us today.